working in there today. Let's wait till everybody gets down. Right through here. Now, whether that's because when they built the building, they just didn't build it straight, probably. These were probably old horse trails just running through town. And I doubt they spent much money on surveying back in 1854. Well, anyway, but we're always looking for new cracks, and there's some that are appearing in the asphalt. And but let's go over and take a look at the valley over here, and let's talk a little bit more about history over here. Down at the other end of by the front of the mission.
Excuse me.
And,
Sorry.
What's really interesting about the place, and one of the things that blew the Indians away, was when they constructed this church, they put that window up there and oriented the construction on the plan of European churches, which would, so that on the winter solstice, light goes in that window, goes all the way down to the other end of the mission, and at sunrise it strikes the altar.
Wow.
And so that's a solstice event in the morning. And what's really interesting is that many mornings you wake up, it may be cloudy most of the day, but there's always a little break of sun over to the west, and it's been over Hollister. And so that's a neat thing about this place. And it's just amazing how much work and construction went into building it. The earthquakes that happened, in 1803 repeated again. There was one in 1836 in the region, and another one in 1838, and it shook the building. And what's amazing is that the sad report that came in after the first or the second earthquake was that the padre that ran the church reported that an old treasured bottle of brandy fell off the shelf and smashed on the floor. But that was the only damage that happened in those 2 earthquakes. Yeah, collateral damage. And but then there was the earthquake in 1906 kind of changed that story. This whole section of the building, some of these columns were broken down, and they actually had to close for almost 60 years the use of the mission because of the structural damage and then the new laws of retrofitting. After all, we are within the fault zone, just beyond that tree right there. So it's now retrofitted and reinforced, but it's still made up of a lot of materials. So I'm not sure I'd like to stay under that shelf there of brick, but this area it survived. There was damage from the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Loma Prieta is the mountain we can see off in the distance just right over here. It's near the San Andreas Fault. But so that's the story of this part. I wanted to point out this old mission cemetery over here. And they say buried in the sacred ground in unmarked graves are about 4,300 mission Indians, Spanish and pioneer settlers. And for those of us who can, I will walk down to the bottom of the stairs. I'm sorry. We'll come back up and get you.
No, that's fine.
Okay. I want to go down and show you the walls down below the mission on here, and then we'll talk about the landscape out here. But the sad story is this town could have become San Jose if things would have gone the way the earlier settlers had hoped. They'd build a mission and a town would grow, and actually this town grew like crazy. It had at its heyday about 20,000 people, and there were 22 bars, and every second floor bar, which was all of them, was a house of ill repute. So, bordello.
Should have made money.
And so you can imagine the weekends when the wagons and the horses came roaring into town, and the guns would be going off, and there were Army barracks right here, and there were other barracks spread around town. This place was thriving. In fact, it was making a fortune in its heyday, literally, selling hay to San Francisco. That was the big crop that came through this area. And then some things started to change. Instead of putting hay on wagons and dragging it all up to San Francisco, they decided to put in a train line. And it was very sneakily done in a very political time in this town's history. San Benito County used to be merged with Monterey County. It was just one big county, and the big hope was to make this the county seat. But a lot of the early post-Civil War soldiers came out, and dominantly white. They bought up land over here and established the town of Hollister. So when the train line was built, it didn't come to San Juan Bautista. It went over to Hollister, and they stole pretty much all the agricultural transport business away from San Juan Bautista. That was when they thought they weren't getting the fair shakes for the economy for Monterey County, because most of the money stayed over there by the coast. They split the county in half, and the county seat for Monterey came over to Salinas. Left San Juan Bautista high dry. Still a crossroads area. The main highway between Los Angeles and San Francisco came and up over the pass and down and around here. This was El Camino Real. We'll be looking down here at it. I mean, if you see the El Camino Real in Los Angeles, it's 8 lanes, and the same as up in San Jose before they built the interstate. When they built the interstate, that was 101, it pretty much really isolated. So this town went from 20,000, it's down to about 1,400 now. But just an incredible amount of history. But back to this story here. In 1868, 2 things also really bad happened. There was a fire over here. It started where the bank is, just 2 blocks down this way, and it burned a huge section of town. And so that caused amazing economic hardship on the town. But then the worst thing happened is all the people coming over the passes would come and stay here at the 2 Plaza Motel. And one of the guests that came and spent the weekend here, somebody noticed that they were sick. They took them in, and they were trying to figure out what was wrong with them, and then they realized, wait a minute, this person has smallpox. And then they started seeing it to spread to the people. Well, the alert went up, soldiers were sent out, surrounded the town, orders to shoot to kill on sight anybody who tried to leave, because they didn't want to cause the outbreak to spread to the other towns. And they waited and waited, and when the illness was over, about 30% of the Spanish, Hispanic population and European population had died, but 100% of the Indian population was wiped out. And they all died, and they were buried out here in the fields and different places, and the town just basically collapsed at that point. But you know, things changed. They opened up a big cement plant. They actually did put in a train line. Used to go out there on the other side of this field out here. But the cement plant closed in the 70s. This town just kind of has a rough time keeping itself going. But the mission now and the park really brings people here, and it keeps the character of this historic old town. Let's go over here and take a look at this view. That's a new addition. They added that later. But there's been various towers around the mission over the years. But so we're standing here on the escarpment. That's the term for a fault, where one side has moved up relative to the other, and you can see this side has definitely moved up. And probably for as much as it has moved up on this side, it sank just as much on that side, but every time it would sink, it would fill in with sediments from the San Benito River, which is currently on the other side of the valley. It'd probably work its way from one side of the valley back and forth. And actually, at different times, when the settlers first came through here, this was all marshland. And there was big areas of water and, you know, abundant wildlife associated with the wetlands. But when they came in, they decided to plant crops. They drained all the fields and the swamps. But what's interesting is you see how flat this valley is that in most areas of the country where streams come out of the hills, it's a gradual slope all the way down into the floodplain. This used to be a lake at different times, and as little as 9,000 years ago, you could probably put a boat in right here and go all the way across the valley. The ice ages were wetter. Also, the fault running down through here goes through a canyon over here along the road towards Watsonville on Highway 129. And there's a narrow part of the canyon where there's been big earthquakes. It would block, or big landslides would come down into the canyon and block the river, and it would cause lakes to backfill up into this valley. And there was an ancient Lake San Juan, and before that there was an ancient Lake Hollister that was even larger, that extended all the way across over to the base of those mountains in the distance over there. These hills over here across the valley, they're called the Barren Hills. The original name was Lomitas Muertas, which I think dead barren hills in Spanish. And then they're also named the Flint Hills, and I was, as a geologist, oh boy, I like to collect flint because that's what they make arrowheads. Well, it turned out to be named after some guy, Harry Flint. so no flint. But there's interesting, the geology, that mountain range is actually rising very quickly, just like this mountain range on this side of the fault. There's another fault called the Sargent Fault that runs through that range. It comes out to the point down there, it crosses across the valley, and then it goes up into the Hollister Hills over there. The town of Hollister is right in the gap over there, and that's where the San Benito River comes through from the other side of a low valley over there. And off in the distance, there's a mountain range. And who knows the name of the range? I mentioned it, and the clue is who knows? What's who knows in Spanish? Quien sabe. That's the name of the mountains.
Quien sabe?
The Quien sabe range. And what's really interesting about the Quien sabe range, and if you know the area well enough, Pinnacles National Monument. What am I saying? It's Pinnacles National Park now, as of a week and a half ago or so, 2 weeks ago, is a remnant of an ancient volcano that formed about 23 million years ago on the San Andreas Fault. And as the fault moved over time, half of that volcano came up from the region down near Bakersfield and is now where it is, just about 40 miles south of here in the Gavilan Range. And 23 million years, it's almost 200 miles. That helped geologists figure out the San Andreas Fault's moving about on an average of about 2 inches a year. But we have earthquakes anywhere between 150 and 300 years. All that pressure builds up and will get released as one earthquake, so the ground will shift anywhere. Typically in a big earthquake of about 6.5, the ground will move about 6 feet. The big earthquakes like the 1906, the land actually wasn't a long time for an earthquake in Northern California. In places up to Point Reyes, it moved 21 feet in the 1906 quake. Down south of Parkfield, way down in the Carrizo Plain area, and down towards Tejon Pass, the 1857 earthquake down there, the ground ripped and actually moved as much as 50 feet in one earthquake. Imagine, that's basically everything inside of a big house moving to the other end of the house in one big shock. Fortunately, from about the edge of the end of the San Juan Valley over here, the fault changes in its character. It has, over there the fault, the bedrock is granite and it breaks and it has big earthquakes like Loma Prieta. But in this area there's a different kind of rock in the subsurface. There's old seafloor crust and serpentinite, the state rock, which grinds up and acts like talc. So in this region the fault is actually usually moving as small little creeping steps. You can see it out here on the roads where the pavement, after they pave it, and you can see it where it crosses the road, the pavement's warping and cracking, and it's just moving as much as a centimeter and a half in some years, usually less than that. Most of the fault's movement is over on the other side of the valley over there in the Calaveras Fault that runs through downtown Hollister. There's a wonderful little park on 6th Street in Dunn where you can actually park and you can see all the curves are offset and you go from one road to the street going through town where it's all been pulled off. Hollister claims I think it's one of 3 cities that claims to be the earthquake capital of the world. The other is Parkfield, and the other one is Coalinga, because they are all on the San Andreas Fault in that area. And but those faults are creeping along, but it's creeping up here at the surface, and it's creeping way down underneath, but some places in the middle it's frozen up. And so that's the unpredictable zones. We don't know when those ones that are frozen locked up. Usually in places where the land is being warped up in mountains is where it's locked up. So there's a locked up section over in that area over there. So anyway, so here's the San Andreas Fault, and it's basically, in the 1906 rupture, there were cracks in the ground that ran along basically where this white fence is. So the main trace of the fault is actually down underneath the field. And what's interesting is the fault is dipping down at an angle about like this, about 70 degrees, 70 to 75 degrees. And ultimately, if you follow it down into the earth for 20 miles, you could be up on top of Fremont Peak up here in the mountains and still be above the San Andreas Fault. It goes back down this way, and that side is slowly moving up relative to this side over here. The fun thing about this road is to think about it in its heyday. Seeing and imagining, the Padres and his henchmen basically would stand here and watch the traffic coming through, and they'd collect tariff. They were the trolls, basically, for maintaining the road. Yeah. And so that's how they controlled the economy. It was right here. And this down here, these cement slabs used to be stands for the rodeo grounds, and this was the rodeo grounds for Juan Bautista down here. And there would be 20,000 people down here on a weekend for a rodeo for many, many, many years. And that all kind of went away. The world has changed, definitely. So let's take a brief walk. We'll go down here, and oh, you know what? This is such a good view. Those mountains over there, the Quien Sabe Range. Each of those peaks over there, the highest one is called Santa Ana Peak. Each one of those peaks is the remnant of an old volcano. And those volcanoes erupted along what was then the San Andreas Fault system over in that area as it was forming. And the earth would crack deep in the mantle, and the lava would get up, injected through the new fault systems, and erupt at the surface. And so the southernmost high peak down there is in an area of volcanoes that have been dated about 12 million years old, whereas the one that you can barely see the top of over the hill there, that's called Elephant Head, up near Gilroy, east of Gilroy. That is that's about 10 million years. And so it took about 2 million years for the fault system to kind of propagate up through here. But then this whole volcanic field got ripped in half. And the part on this side of the fault moved up northward. It's all the way up in the area around Berkeley now, 70 miles in 10 to 12 million years. And so that fault system is ripping and moving along, and that's what makes the Hayward Fault so dangerous, is that's probably the biggest disaster waiting to happen to Northern California, is when the Hayward Fault eventually rips. And so we do a lot of earthquake preparedness in that region. If you live up in that region, hope you think about getting prepared, because it could happen any day.
We'll get our feet on
Yeah. So, well, let's go down there. Area, but there is quite a bit of oak forests on the north slopes up here. And, they made them carry it in a long way from different places. But that's what they did to people back in those days. You worked from morning till you went to bed at night.
Up to sundown.
Yeah.
And then some.
And then some, yeah. So this is the old Mission Cemetery wall. Now, just like cemeteries in Europe, you can go to many churches in Europe. You have to go up almost to the second floor to be standing on the ground, because over the centuries, as people are buried, the land surface rises up. And so the cemetery was filled in over time with most, but along the way they had to expand the wall, and they actually had to repair it at times because of the earthquake damage. And you can actually, if you look carefully, you can kind of see 4 zones of rock in this wall. And you can see that this first layer down here has larger pieces, and it's actually the stuff they used to hold it together was a better mix than the stuff that was used later. The original version, you can see some of the brick was added in to the construction of the wall. And what's interesting is that this whole wall is kind of sloping downhill this way, and then they build another layer, and the landscape is moving. That side is rising up, and the whole wall has kind of been rotating. What's really happening is that for every foot that this side is rising and this side is sinking, this side is actually moving about 10 feet on the Pacific side of the fault, and on the North American side, relatively the land is moving this way. And it just kind of shows that this is really, not in the scale of a lifetime or a memory, really. The landscape is changing here. In historic times, we can see that the landscape is changing and moving. Well, they added another level, and then you can see after that they added the 2 more levels. And some places you can see where the lower part was broken and repaired along here, and those were probably from the damaging earthquakes. But it's kind of interesting to see in North America a kind of a history like this. This is a European kind of thing you'd want to see. This place was famous for these olive trees, and you'll see lots of olive trees, and the big wonderful trees over here, California pepper trees. They're not from California, they're from Bolivia. But they were planted here, and there's some monster ones. So what I'd like to do is let's walk back up, and if you haven't been down to the rock shop, I'd like to walk you down around the town this way into just the downtown area, and then in the rock shop there's a hallway that's full of maps and information that I'd like to offer you guys to look at, so you can look at where your home is. We've got maps of California and all the faults in this area, and we can talk about field trip destinations in this area beyond where we're at. So let's walk back up there. We'll go up to the Plaza Hotel and look at it. Yes, made a monument here. At one time there was a seismograph that you could come here and see when the earthquakes were, but now everything's done online. They don't even make those old kind of seismographs anymore. And but they had a walking tour, and that's where the walking tour started. The USGS commemorated their 100th anniversary here because so much was learned about the nature of the science of plate tectonics. It was basically right here on the San Andreas Fault. Before the 1906 earthquake, everybody thought faults moved like this. They had no idea that they moved this way. And that became the driving force for trying to understand what led to the science of plate tectonics. And if you take a geology course, that's what you'd learn about. I teach a geology class at Gavilan College, and that's what I'm teaching them right now. In fact, the same tour is next week in the class. We're going to come over here and take a look at so this is the Miss Vicky house.
Mama.
Miss Vicky was one of the residents here that lived here her whole life, passed away I think in the 1920s, but this was her house. Used to be located down where the bank is now, and it was one of the few houses that survived that fire in that section of town. And now, when they moved it from out of the fire into right onto the fault. So,
Frying pan.
The frying pan here. And what's interesting is if you look at this landscape, it was built originally in the style of the Spanish mission, where they build a plaza, and it's hard not to assume that this whole plaza was extremely flat when it was built. Now there's a warp here, and the land actually kind of it's downhill that way. And so this is what we're calling on the crest of what's called an anticline, where rock layers are being folded up and over the top of the fault as it's moving along here. And it's just how much change there has been, but it's imperceptible unless you think about it and look at the clues. This landscape is very dynamic, and it's not just here, it's all along the fault systems in California that we have to remember this, and that's why this field trip is so important, because there's a story here that can be taken to other places. And so it's fun to think about this amazing town and its history. I mean, and on the first Saturday they dress up and come in a historic dress here to recreate what's going on. And it's not quite as many people as there used to be coming through here, but it's just amazing to think about all the shenanigans that have gone on in this town. Fun things that the soldiers were playing pranks and blowing up cannons, and all kinds of crazy stuff went on in this town. And I can't imagine how many, well, there are plenty of lynchings down here on the Alameda in its history. And, this town every fall has, around Halloween, has a ghost walk, and it's kind of fun because there's all fun stories about this town and that kind of genre. So we're going to walk back past here. This building right here, there's the state park has an office in there and a little gift store, but let me take you down to 3rd Street over here in the historic downtown.